Thank you so much. My name is Munyendo, and I'm a PhD student at the George Washington University. And today, I'm very excited to present to you our recent work about user concerns with mobile loan apps in Kenya. Before I begin, I'd like to thank my wonderful co-authors, Yasemin Acar and Aviv, who are very supportive of this work. So about a year ago, I received this message from my youngest sister. She was clearly freaking out about something. Before I could respond, she followed it up with this other message, and it said, "I think someone used my details to borrow money." She then proceeded to forward me the message she had received, and it said, "Kindly inform Jacob to clear his Opesa loan of cash 9,000 by 2 p.m. on this date, or he risks being listed with CFB and legal action taken against him. Remember, you are nominated as a referee. Strive to reach him or help him pay." I was quite shocked by this because my youngest sister is only still in high school, and there's no way she could have provided her details to anyone as a guarantor for any loan, never mind having this kind of money in the first place. So I became quite interested in these apps, and I quickly went online, and within just a few queries, I saw many news articles outlining how mobile loan apps in Kenya use unscrupulous means to try and force users to repay their loans. So what really are mobile loan apps? Mobile loan apps are these apps that users download from stores, whether that's Android's Google Play, Apple Store, or even other third-party markets with the goal of procuring loans. These apps have become very common in the developing world because of the speed and ease in which they are able to offer small loans to users without requiring any formal credit history or collateral. Kenya particularly has been one of the developing countries that has seen widespread adoption and usage of these apps, and this is mostly because of a very well-established mobile money ecosystem that not only enables these apps to easily disburse these loans to the users, but also provides a wealth of financial transactional information through SMS that are generated when users are using these services. So in this study, we were interested in exploring three key research questions. Number one, we wanted to explore what are the most common mobile loan apps in Kenya, as well as the permissions they require. Number two, we wanted to explore whether users understand how various permissions are used by these apps. And lastly, we were interested in user concerns, trade-offs, and behavior with these apps. We focus quite a bit on permissions because we believe that understanding how various permissions are used is very important when it comes to users securing their privacy, not just with mobile loan apps, but with mobile apps in general. So to address our research questions, we conducted semi-structured interviews with 20 mobile loan app users in Kenya. We recruited our participants through social media platforms, including Twitter and WhatsApp stories, and we also used snowballing, where participants recommended other potential users of these apps. We simultaneously performed open coding as we administered our interviews, and with no new themes emerging after around 15 interviews, we ultimately ended our data collection after 20 interviews. For the interviews themselves, we first asked participants to indicate all mobile loan apps they had previously used or were currently using. We then asked participants to focus on their most used loan app for the remainder of the interview. After asking participants to indicate or explain how these apps work, we asked them to indicate their reasons for using these apps. We then asked participants to provide all the things they like as well as dislike about this app, as well as any concerns and general behavior when using this app. Lastly, we asked participants to indicate all permissions required by their most used loan app by referring to the settings menu on their phone. Thereafter, we asked participants to explain what they thought each of these permissions is used by the apps, as well as any concerns or non-concerns with these apps accessing these permissions. If you'd like to see our full interview protocol, please refer to our paper. For our demographics, We had an equal split between male and female participants. However, most of our participants tended to be young, with most of them aged between 25 and 29 years. Most of our participants were very well educated, with most of them having a bachelor's degree, and most of them were formally employed. So what did we find? I'm going to highlight some of the key and interesting findings we got from this work, but if you want to see our full results, please refer to our paper. Well, our results indicate that mobile loan apps fill a very crucial financial gap in the developing world by offering many small loans to users that would otherwise struggle to procure loans from traditional financial institutions such as banks, or also just because they can't access the services in the first place. Particularly, most participants seem to appreciate the speed in which these apps are able to offer them loans, with P12 saying that the good thing with mobile loan apps is that you get the money instantly. It doesn't even take like 5 minutes. Participants also seemed to appreciate the minimal paperwork required by these apps when offering them loans, with P16 saying that when you compare them with bank loans, you will go to the bank, see the manager, fill a form, look for guarantors. It may even take a month for you to procure the loan. But for the loan apps, they are instant. Finally, a combination of the speed in which these apps are able to offer these loans, as well as the minimal paperwork they require, seemed very ideal for participants when they were having emergencies. For example, P11 said that it's quite helpful, especially when you have an emergency, as compared to other loans like from banks. The processing time for bank loans is not convenient. So in terms of how common these apps are, we found that these apps are indeed widely used, with Tala and Branch by far the most popular. Tala has over 5 million downloads, and Branch has over 10 million downloads. And this is just on Android's Google Play alone. At the same time, however, we found that most of the common mobile loan apps require access to many user permissions, with each of the most common loan apps we explored requiring access to users' contacts, SMS, location, and storage permissions. At the same time, though, we found that these apps do not transparently disclose to users how they use all this data that they collect from them. And we'll see more about this shortly. So in terms of whether users understand how these apps potentially, in terms of how users understand how these permissions are used, we found that most participants seem to understand how contacts and SMS are potentially used by these apps. And this is most likely because of past experiences, where these apps either sent them SMS or reached out to their contacts when they defaulted. So for contacts specifically, P13 indicated that I think it's because once I default, they can call those people. However, what's interesting here is the fact that most of these apps do not seem to inform users that all this data is going to be used this way. For SMS, most participants indicated that this permission is required so that these apps can calculate their credit worthiness. And this is also in line with what the apps generally say in their privacy policies. So for example, P20 said that in your phone, you have M-Pesa messages. They use part of that to gauge how much they can give you. However, we found that most participants did not understand the potential usage of their telephone, storage, and surprisingly, camera by these apps. For telephone and camera specifically, most participants informed us that they do not know how these permissions are used. While for storage, we had a few participants who provided incorrect reasons how this permission can actually be used. P1, for example, wondered how their storage is going to help. The money is not going to eat up my storage. That's so funny. One of our goals with this study was to explore concerns that users have with these apps, and most participants seem to be very concerned about the high interest rates, as well as short repayment periods offered by these apps in comparison to other financial institutions. For example, P1 said that their interest rate is so high, as much as 20%. Several participants surprisingly indicated that they were concerned about borrowing addiction, stemming from the easy access they have to loans with these apps. For example, P19 said that you are ever in a debt cycle. You have to borrow from this one app to repay this other app, and so on and so forth. Regarding permissions, almost all our participants indicated being very concerned about this app's access to their contacts. For example, P1 told us that they'll start calling your parents or they'll start calling your brothers and sisters because they've got your contacts. They just call anyone. And this is exactly what happened to my sister, by the way. P11 narrated how they once called their father-in-law after they defaulted. They called my father-in-law. Do you know someone called the participant's name? Remind her to pay our loan worth $6,000. Then they also sent him countless messages. I felt bad and embarrassed. Other concerning permissions that were mentioned by participants included access to their camera, location, and SMS. For camera, most participants indicated that they feared they'll be spied on by these apps, and for location, participants indicated fearing that they'll be tracked by these applications. And lastly, for SMS, most participants indicated that they feared their private conversations will actually be accessed by these apps. We also had several other security and privacy concerns from our study, and one thing that was mentioned was a concern that these apps will generally share users' data with third parties, especially when it comes to recovering their loans. For example, P9 said that in the case where you don't pay the loan on time, they tend to give your information to some third parties. Some participants also indicated being worried that these apps do not provide any way for them to kind of like opt out and their data to be deleted when they stopped using these applications. And here, for example, P20 said that one thing I don't like is that they don't give you an option to opt out and for them to sort of delete or do away with your data. So despite all these concerns, most of our participants indicated overlooking them because they are more motivated to procure loans. For example, P1 said that the funny thing is that when you need the money, you won't care about privacy issues. P11, on the other hand, added that you don't know what they want to do with your data. But again, they say desperate times call for desperate measures. You need the cash, you don't have an alternative. Surprisingly, a few participants indicated being unconcerned with access to certain permissions for various reasons. This was particularly the case for access to storage and telephone. And this was actually surprising because participants indicated they were unconcerned with access to these permissions because they really don't know how these permissions are used by the app. Participants also seemed to be unconcerned with access to certain permissions if they genuinely believed that these permissions were required by the loan app. And this was particularly the case for access to participants' location and contacts permission. So for example, P13 said that I don't think they have collateral. If you fail to pay them and disappear, they will undergo a loss. So I really think that the location permission is okay. Lastly, some participants indicated being unconcerned with access to certain permissions if they believed that they had privacy workarounds around them, even though sometimes this was misinformed. For example, P17 said that I move from time to time. If they want to know where I am, tomorrow I won't be in this place and my location might be different. I don't think it's necessary. So now that we know all this, what can we really do to protect users of these apps? While a lot of prior work has suggested providing more transparency and giving users more control of data that's collected from them, we do believe that this user demographic is more motivated to procure loans, and so these recommendations might not actually deter them from giving away their privacy. And so we argue that regulators can play a very key role in helping protect these users. And one thing they can particularly do is to regulate the loan terms of these apps to prevent what looks like outright user exploitation when it comes to things like interest rates. And even more important, we believe that regulators should curate appropriate data privacy laws, particularly local regulators, that can help protect these users. And this is particularly something that's already being advanced and discussed in Kenya. We also believe that application markets can also play a key role in helping protect these users. And one thing they can particularly do is to occasionally review some of the user reviews about apps on their platforms with the goal of investigating and potentially removing apps that outright violate users' privacy. They can also additionally use machine learning approaches just to make sure that all apps on their platform do actually detail how they use all the different data points they collect from users, specifically regarding various permissions. Lastly, we do recommend the loan apps to be more transparent about their data collection practices, as some participants seemed not to be concerned with access to certain permissions if they do know why that information is being collected. To summarize, our study explored user concerns, trade-offs, and behavior with mobile loan apps in Kenya. We find that loan apps are very useful and provide many useful loans to users, but at the same time collect and routinely misuse a lot of sensitive user information. At the same time, though, most users seem to overlook their privacy concerns to procure loans. We conclude by offering some recommendations that can offer a good starting point to protect these users. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll now take questions.
All right, thank you.
Hey, Colin, great talk. One question I had, if these apps, like if the user refused to give the permission, would they just stop working? Or it will like behave incorrectly?
Yes, that's a good question. So with the recent developments in the Android ecosystem, Android has been getting developers to be able to. Android has suggested that developers should find ways for their apps to only run with the minimal number of permissions. And so that's something they've been pushing developers to do. But from our study, we mostly found that participants who are worried about being denied the loans if they didn't grant certain permissions. And so ultimately, most of them felt very inclined to grant access to all the permissions that were required by these apps. But that could be a possible direction of future research, investigating whether these apps.
Or like remove the permission after they give or they get the loan and then remove it, or something like that, if that's possible. But contacts and all, you can't.
Yeah.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you for the great question.
Hey, thanks for the great talk. My question is going to be on some of the permissions. So you said some of the users were concerned with, say, the camera access and the location. Was it clear why these apps were using these permissions? The users were concerned with spying, but why did they need access to cameras?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it does look like most of these apps will require access to a wide variety of permissions from users. I don't know if some of this is needed for future upgrades and stuff like that. But from looking at their privacy policies, most of them do indicate that they need access to all these permissions to calculate users' credit worthiness, but they don't explicitly say why they would need access to someone's camera, for instance.
Hi.
One quick question.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great talk. I saw that users tend to have multiple apps installed. Did they ever consider security and privacy reasons when selecting among those apps?
Yes, that's a great question. So unfortunately, we were not able to gather that from our interviews. But something that I think actually happens is that users will go out and try to just download as many of these apps as possible when they're in a financial hitch. And so for most parts, security and privacy is an afterthought, and most people are just thinking about loans when they're downloading these apps.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
All right, let's thank our speaker again.